All right, class. This is Unit 7.8. So we're in Unit 7 of the AP curriculum, topic 7.8. This is 1920s culture and political controversies is the main subject for this section. Okay, so a couple things we need to know to put this the 1920s into context in terms of culture and politics. By 1920, a majority of the United States population at this point was living in urban centers. We had the migration from the rural areas to urban centers, and now more than 50% of the population of the United States, for the first time, is living in urban or city centers versus in a rural or farm setting. First time in the nation's history by the 1920s. So this increased economic opportunities for women, economic opportunities for migrants from other countries, international migrants, also, it increased opportunities for internal migrants emigrating from one state to another or moving from, most cases, from the south to the north generally. Those moving from uh, out of rural conditions where the economy may not have been as good as it used to be. So they're moving into city for a different type of work, different type of lifestyle, possibly to take advantage of, if available, modern electricity and plumbing for the first time in a lot of cases in these cities in the 1920s. After World War I had ended, there was what's known as nativist campaigns. Now, native means you were born in that particular area. You are a native to that area. If you're born in Louisiana, you are a native Louisianian. You're born in New Orleans, you're a native New Orleanian. You didn't emigrate there or move there from someone else. You're not an immigrant. So these nativist campaigns were organized um, against some ethnic groups, depending on what part of the country you're talking about. There was a strong anti-German sentiment in much of the Northeast in New York at this time. There was a very strong anti-Italian sentiment. Um, there was Chinese sentiment was very, very strong, as well as German and Japanese at this point in history, primarily to do what was going on in the war in Europe just prior to this. And these sentiments and these nativist groups, these natives groups led to the passage of quotas, which began to restrict immigration, uh, specifically from Southern Europe, mostly. Let's go back one second, and I want to focus in on something about these urban centers and some of these native groups, just to highlight one key piece of evidence that you could use when talking about nativism and immigration, especially from Europe and Southern Europe specifically. There was a one immigrant who became very famous, who's the son of immigrant parents who came over. He was actually an immigrant himself, rather. He was born in Italy and he came over with his parents. Hector Boiardi. He got together with a guy by the name of Louis Nichols and created a cookbook, famous Italian chef dishes by Chef Hector Boiardi. This was in 1930. Now, it became very popular, and his name became anglicized, including in its spelling, which means that it took the Italian sound and spelling of his name, converted it to make it more appealing to a Anglo-speaking audience. Let me pull up an image really quickly of what I'm talking about. You might recognize this. Chef Boyardee was actually Hector Boyardee, the original, and they changed it to Boyardee, easier to pronounce, and it is very, very popular to this day, in fact. It's one example of anglicization of an immigrant, different cultures, product, cuisine, etc., absorbing into society, known as Americanization of the product. Also, um, excuse me, in terms of, let's see, where was I? Oh, in in terms of in the politics, in terms of the nativist sentiment, there's a couple of court cases that highlight this nativism or this nativist attitude. One we're going to take a look at here. This is Takawa Ozawa versus the United States in 1922. Now, this case was about should the United States limit citizens that have East Asian ancestry, specifically Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, as in Mr. Ozawa's case. And the argument was they're not born here, so they're not automatically citizens under the 14th Amendment. Should we allow them to enter the country? That's what this case was about in 1922. And it was a very strong conversation around closing the borders on both coasts and the north and south border as well to immigrants because they were worried about the loss of the Anglican culture going back to the founding. And this is one specific case that was about East Asian ancestry. There was another case, the United States versus Batsing Thind, um, which was almost parallel with the Ozawa case in terms of restricting immigration from East Asia into America. This case wanted to exclude all Asian immigrants from all of Asia into the United States and barring them from obtaining citizenship through the naturalization process, which naturalization is, according to the 14th Amendment, is under the purview of Congress. Only Congress can create legislation that regulates and creates the process for naturalization for immigrant to become a citizen. This case was challenging whether that should be a process at all for anyone from all of Asia. This was 1923. Okay. Let's see. Migration also gave rise to new art forms and literature that expressed ethnic and regional identities. This was one of the prominent examples of this was the Harlem Renaissance in New York, where we have a whole range of literature, music coming out of this time. Um, some quick examples. Duke Ellington, who collaborated, a very famous band leader, Duke Ellington, collaborating with Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald in this time period in the 1920s, 1930s. There was also a Chinese Revolutionary Artist Club on the West Coast in San Francisco, where these immigrants who were trying to, and different ethnicities, trying to hold on to their culture, in this case, Chinese, in pockets in San Francisco, and also have the rise of Chinatowns in various cities, Chicago, New York, and other areas. In fact, in New Orleans, the French Quarter in this time frame became known as Little Palermo because there were so many Sicilian immigrants, Palermo, capital of Sicily, where many of the immigrants from Sicily came, and Italy generally came to New Orleans, just from the ports of Palermo, and the French Quarter became known as Little Palermo, but from 1920 to about 1940, because there was so much of an Italian influence in the city. Also, Syrians was another strong ethnic group that had a hefty population in the 1920s in different parts of America, mostly New York and New Orleans area. Langston Hughes began his literary career in the 20s during the Harlem Renaissance. Very famous. You might have probably picked him up in some of your English classes. One of my favorite authors, Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote the seminal work, probably her magnum opus, "Their Eyes Were Watching God," which I strongly recommend you read. I've read it 3 times now. It is a fantastic book in terms of its literary scope, imagery, and insight into 1920s, 1930s roughly time frame through the eyes of an African American experiencing American culture in different parts of the South. It's an absolutely phenomenal book. Um, so 1920s culture and political controversies began to emerge as Americans also debated besides immigration, they debated gender roles. Sorry, I had the video cut off there. There were people were debating gender roles, modernism. In other words, all the industry we've been talking about, the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and all the innovations that were introduced, Edison's moving picture device, new cameras, electricity, innovations in rail, steam, the car, combustible steam engine, all of these things that were becoming plumbing, which was becoming a thing in the 1920s, modernism. So there were debates about how is that going to transform society for better or for worse. Are people going to lose jobs because of these innovations? Are some people going to gain jobs? Are jobs going to shift? We already saw a massive movement from agriculture to urban centers in the cities, which is putting increased pressure, people living closer together from different cultures and identities. That melting pot, is it boiling over? Is it cracking? What's going on? So all that was at play. Science and religion issues also come to the forefront, as we're going to see pretty soon, with some couple of famous court cases in this time period. Calvin Coolidge is someone who, well, he's going to become president, but in 1924, in a letter he had written to a constituent concerned about race issues. He told them in this letter, Calvin Coolidge was a proponent of races, being equal under the law. He said in his letter that all men, he asserted that all men, regardless of their race, are guaranteed equal rights by the Constitution. He was essentially quoting the Equal Rights Clause of the 14th Amendment, which which we're going to find out in the 1950s when we get to that unit, Brown versus Board of Education, a famous case that overturns segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson. And Coolidge was a proponent of ending segregation in that sense. There was also the Immigration Act of 1924. Forgot to mention. So that was something else that, sorry, I cut off again. The Immigration Act of 1924, which was a quota based immigration system that Congress passed in response to these cultural and ethnic clashes that were happening in the cities and these blendings and the melting pot that wasn't happening in some cases. So they decided to put a quota based system that said, um, depending on how many people were in the country prior to a certain earlier decade from a certain country, only that percentage or a percentage based on that would be allowed in past 1924. Essentially, what the math worked out to was if you were from Southern Europe, specifically Italy is what they were targeting, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Spain, those areas, and you wanted to come into the country post the Immigration Act of 1924, it was pretty much nil. It's not going to happen because the immigration from Italy was so prominent. There were so many people coming over from 1880 roughly till 1920 that they said, nope, we've got too many Italians. We're going to cut it off. And this actually affected my family directly. My grandfather's family, essentially his brothers, cousins, well, weren't allowed to come over at that point. They came over. My direct ancestors came over in 1902, cut off in 1924, so that wasn't an option. And this happened for thousands of families across the United States when they put this law into place. Um, Also, somebody else we're going to talk about later in future lectures, Alice Paul, arguing for the Equal Rights Amendment for women, which began in later in this time period. Other famous names that are going to come up are uh, the Scopes trial involving William Jennings Bryant. You might have heard that name from last unit, or earlier in this unit, rather. And Clarence Darrow. We're going to talk about that coming up in some future lectures. Um, all right.